Way out here they got a name for rain and wind and fire. The rain is
Welcome back, folks,
the
to part
fire
2
Joe,
on our unit on the respiratory system. And this one we're going to cover the various events in respiration before respiratory events and how we control our respiration. It's pretty important. So those 4 main events are pulmonary ventilation, moving air in and out of the lung. So we would normally just call that breathing, right? But the technical term is pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary for lungs, ventilation, moving air. External respiration, which is where we do gas exchange in the lungs between the air and the blood. So it's actually exchanging gases with the outside world, with the outside air, right? So getting the oxygen in, the carbon dioxide out. External respiration. Respiratory gas transport, we're not going to really spend any time on that. Well, I guess we'll spend a little bit of time on that in here, but that has to do with the circulatory system. And then finally, once that circulatory system gets the gases down to the tissues, we have internal respiration where we're exchanging gases between internal systems, between the blood and the tissue surrounding it. So let's start off by taking a look at breathing itself. Okay, inspiration is bringing air in. Expiration is breathing air out. And it's simply caused by a volume change in the thoracic cavity and lungs. Okay. So in inspiration, muscles contract, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. Let me bring this dude over here. Okay, so we see with this guy here, we can't see the diaphragm in here, but it'll be sitting right here, right? And it's up like a dome shape. When you breathe in, it's all domed when it's relaxed. When you breathe in, you contract it, it flattens out, and that increases the volume in the chest cavity. In addition, these intercostal muscles here between the ribs, they lift the whole rib cage up and out, so that increases the volume of the chest cavity. So you got pulling down with the diaphragm and up and out with the ribs when you breathe in. That's inspiration. You're generating a vacuum in here, and the only way for air to get into that vacuum is through your airway. Unless, of course, you've got a pneumothorax, which you talked about last time. So like I said, that causes an increase in lung volume. Remember, the pleural fluid is what kind of allows the lungs to kind of go with. It's kind of like a sticky fluid almost. It's not sticky, but forms a suction cup-like seal that brings the lungs out, and it can only be filled via your airway. Here I've got an example. We've got a relatively incompressible chest cavity here, so to speak, with this bell jar. One way for air to get in and a diaphragm on the bottom. We don't have ribs, but diaphragm is normally up like this. And when I pull down on it, increases the volume in there. And the only way to get more, to replace that volume, nature abhors a vacuum, is to bring air into the lungs. So that's how that volume change causes a change in the amount of air we are breathing in. All right, expiration, breathing out. So it's a passive process. Muscles relax and return to rest. So the diaphragm will relax and go back up into the chest cavity, and the intercostal muscles will relax and the chest will fall, and that will create a smaller volume in the chest cavity, which will push the air out. In addition, the lungs, like I talked about last time with that whole pig example, the lungs recoil because of the elastic and surface tension, and they get smaller as well. So you don't really need to expend energy to exhale. You expend energy to inhale. Exhale is passive. Now, you can force more expiration. You can squeeze internal intercostal muscles, which will bring the chest down even smaller, contract your abdominal muscles, and force your guts basically up into your chest cavity. Those are all ways to force a shrinkage of the volume up here and get more air out if you need to. So here we can see in this diagram, on the top we have inspiration. We can see the diaphragm's going down and the rib muscles are coming up. And you can see the difference in the size of the chest cavity there on the right. And on the bottom, expiration, chest cavity falls, difference in volume on the right. All right, and that brings us to respiratory volumes, or how much air can we actually get in there? Okay. We can measure this with a few different measurements. Tidal volume is the amount of air moving in and out during normal breathing. So the volume of air that, and when I'm just standing here, not doing much anything, just goes out and in, out and in. Kind of like the tides go in and out on the shore. Now, do the tides represent all the water in the ocean? No. Still a lot more in the ocean, but the tides are the noticeable change in the volume at the shore, right? So we call this tidal volume. It's that noticeable amount going in and out. I can measure that with an instrument like this called the spirometer. I can only blow on, so it'll measure the amount of air I blow out. I just turn the wheel and I'll just blow a bunch so you can see it go. Now, was that tidal volume? No, because I blew for a lot longer than I would normally blow for tidal volume. Tidal volume is usually a couple hundred milliliters volume in there. Okay. Now, inspiratory reserve volume. Now, inspiration is breathing in. Reserve is extra, right? So it's the amount that can be forced in over the tidal volume. So if I'm normally breathing in, out, right? I could take a deeper breath in and then breathe a whole bunch more in. And if I do that, that extra amount I can force in to really fill up my lungs and my chest cavity is my inspiratory reserve. Okay. Don't normally use that, but I'll use it if I'm, say, playing a trombone, or I'm going to sing, or I want to talk loud. I'll bring in a big breath so that I can spit it out there and get some volume with it, because I need more air movement with it. So that's inspiratory reserve. On the other hand, you have expiratory reserve. This is the amount extra that can be forced out over the tidal volume. So after if you're just normally breathing, you breathe a little bit out, you should be able to squeeze out more air after that, right? There's just air that kind of sitting in the lungs that you can squeeze out if you tighten your abdominal muscles and tighten your internal intercostals. So normal breath out. That bit extra is my expiratory reserve volume. Okay. Now, is there still air in my lungs after I blow everything out I can blow? I hope so. Otherwise, I'd have collapsed lungs and a collapsed airway. And that extra stuff that kind of sits in there when the lungs are as empty as you want to get them, because any more empty, they'd be collapsed, is called residual volume. Air that cannot be forced out unless I was to get run over with a steamroller or something. And this allows continuous gas exchange and keeps the alveoli inflated. And that brings us to something called vital capacity. Vital capacity is the total amount of exchangeable air. So it's the capacity you have for total air movement in your lungs. And that's the tidal volume. And then both reserve volumes gives you your vital capacity. Does not include the residual volume, which is that leftover stuff. So the total amount of air that you can have in your lungs is going to be less than your vital capacity. Okay. So there you go. That is vital capacity. It's something that we can't do in a pandemic with spirometers, but in non-pandemic years, we'll take the spirometers out and we'll measure our tidal volumes, our inspiratory reserve, expiratory reserve. We'll calculate our vital capacity. Do you have any idea what kind of a normal range for a lot of people is? Yeah. It's usually measured, we wind up measuring it in the liters. So I've had some really big guys, big chests, having vital capacities close to 6 liters. And I've had some fairly small people with small chests, small bodies, might be more like 3 liters, because it all has to do with the volume of your chest cavity. If you're, a well-trained endurance athlete or a tuba player who's used to really maximizing the amount of air you get in and move out, you might be able to eke out a little bit more, but still the limit is the size of your chest cavity. Regardless of how well you train, your chest cavity is only a certain size and there's only so much air you can move. So that's getting air in and out of the lungs. And that's only the first step in the battle. If we weren't land creatures who need to keep our lungs moist and warm in order to do gas exchange, we wouldn't have to worry about any of that. We could just have gills on the outside and we'd be fine. But we are terrestrial animals, which means our lungs are internal. So we got to do all that other stuff. Now we get to the part that is common to all structures or all organisms that need to get air, oxygen in, and carbon dioxide out of their system. And that comes back to that very simple process of diffusion that you've learned about multiple times in your science career. But just a quick review. All molecules have kinetic energy, the energy of motion, right? They're always moving. Now they're moving randomly. which means they tend to spread out, okay, which then makes it appear that they are moving from an area of high concentration to low. Pack a whole bunch of food coloring in a little drop that we put in a beaker of water, and we let it sit for a while. Those molecules spread out until they're equally distributed all throughout the fluid. And that's what nature wants to happen. Everything wants to go to evenly spread out. Okay? And our bodies use that. They really use that when it comes to moving gases. So let's take a look at external respiration with this. So there is always more oxygen in the air in the alveoli than in the blood because we're always using up oxygen. So we can never get more oxygen that's in the atmosphere in our blood. There's always going to be a higher concentration of oxygen, as you see down there in that picture, in the air. Okay? Which means oxygen is going to go from high to low into the blood. On the other hand, there's always going to be more carbon dioxide in the blood than in the air in the alveoli because we're always making carbon dioxide. Okay, so we're always making more carbon dioxide than we're bringing in. So we're making that carbon dioxide, converting the oxygen into carbon dioxide, which means there's always going to be more carbon dioxide in our blood. So carbon dioxide will always diffuse from the blood into the air in the alveolus. Okay, so diffusion, the body doesn't have to do anything except make sure those concentration gradients are there. And that's there simply by the nature of how cellular respiration works. We use up the oxygen and make carbon dioxide. So gas transport. So once we get the gas in the blood, how do we move it around in the blood? How does the blood carry that gas? Well, we mentioned this a little bit in the circulatory system. Oxygen is mostly bound up in hemoglobin. When that happens, we call it oxyhemoglobin, and there's 4 molecules of oxygen gas bound up with every molecule of hemoglobin. Okay. There is some dissolved in the plasma, but it's never a great amount. That's not a very efficient way to carry it. If we don't have enough hemoglobin, we can't get enough oxygen in our blood. We can't pack it in dense enough to handle our metabolism. By binding it up with the hemoglobin, that artificially reduces the free oxygen in our blood, which keeps that oxygen concentration in the blood low compared to the air. So oxygen is going to keep diffusing in, and the hemoglobin is going to suck it up and bind it and get it out of that circulation so it can take it elsewhere. And that helps to drive a faster diffusion, more diffusion in our blood than if it was just trying to dissolve into the plasma. We can never quite get enough that way. All right, so that's oxygen. Carbon dioxide, a little bit different. Some is in the hemoglobin because oxygen, or the carbon dioxide is actually the trigger to release the oxygen. When your hemoglobin gets to a part of the body that's producing carbon dioxide in high enough amounts, some of that carbon dioxide will bind to the hemoglobin to get carried back to the lungs. But when it binds the hemoglobin, it's going to release all that extra oxygen that hemoglobin was carrying. The hemoglobin is going to change shape, release the oxygen. So that's good. But it's mostly floating around our blood in the form of a bicarbonate ion. As you see here on the right-hand side of this equation, we see bicarbonate, HCO3. That bicarbonate ion is what's going to be holding that in our blood. Okay, so we breathe out that carbon dioxide, or that carbon dioxide comes out of our cells, combines with water to make carbonic acid, which then dissociates to become bicarbonate and a hydrogen ion, and actually causes our blood to maintain acidity because we got free floating hydrogen. That is hydrogen ion that is going to, that's basically an acid, right? Our blood's not acidic, but that's how we maintain the pH of our blood. So that's floating around. So that gets bound up in that bicarbonate when it comes out, and then it's carried through our bodies as that bicarbonate ion. Okay. When we want to release it back into the air, it will combine with hydrogen, turn to carbonic acid, and then go into carbon dioxide and water, and we can breathe out the carbon dioxide. Okay. And that's how we transport it. Okay, in our blood. It's this equation. It's reversible. It's just wherever you have a higher concentration, it'll drive it one way or the other. Okay, so if I have too much bicarbonate and hydrogen, that's going to cause it to bind to form carbonic acid, which will cause it to become carbon dioxide and water. If I got too much carbon dioxide and water, it'll bind into carbonic acid and become bicarbonate and hydrogen. So we got too much carbon dioxide in the tissues when it's being released from cellular respiration, so it goes into the bicarbonate, but when we get to the lungs and we're getting rid of carbon dioxide, we don't have enough carbon dioxide in there, so we've got too much bicarbonate there technically, and that's going to fall apart and become carbon dioxide, which we can breathe out. So internal respiration, I just kind of went over that. It's the reverse reaction. Still relies on diffusion to move the molecules once they are released. So here we can see on the right in the tissues, oxygen's always higher in the blood when it gets to the tissues. So it's going to diffuse into the blood because the tissues are using up oxygen. So they're always going to have a little bit lower oxygen because they're using it up. So oxygen will go into the tissues. But the tissues are always making carbon dioxide. So there's always going to be a higher concentration of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissues into the blood. Then when that deoxygenated blood, right, gets back to the lungs, it reverses like we talked about before. And we drop off that carbon dioxide and pick up the oxygen. And it all happens again. Internal respiration's on the right here. External respiration's on the left, even though it says internal respiration on the top. All right, let's talk about carbon monoxide poisoning, CO poisoning. You may have heard of this. You may have CO detectors in your house that'll beep. Carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin in the same location as oxygen, because there's just a carbon and an oxygen, and that oxygen end can stick into the hemoglobin. And that carbon monoxide will outcompete the O2 molecules. It'll get in there better than the oxygen molecules, and it'll stick in there. Okay, and this is one of the leading causes of death in fires, because fires that aren't burning efficiently will create a lot of carbon monoxide, which will cause that. And with carbon monoxide poisoning, one thing you don't get is you don't get cyanosis. Even though I think, oh, you don't have enough oxygen, that means we should be cyanotic, right? Blue skin, blue lips, and tiredness, right? You don't see that. What happens is you don't see the cyanosis. You see cherry red skin, because we do have oxygen in the form of CO bound to the hemoglobin, which actually makes your it's filling up more of the hemoglobin binding sites than would normally be filled by oxygen, because we're always dropping off some, picking up some. But here that CO just gets in the carbon into the hemoglobin and stays there cycle after cycle after cycle. So we build up and more of it's attached to the hemoglobin. So we get brighter red blood. But we're not releasing any oxygen. Our tissues and our brain is not getting the oxygen it needs. So we have all those symptoms of confusion, headaches, fatigue. People often will get nauseous, dizzy, breathless. They'll lose consciousness. And it's pretty sad if it happens in the evening when people are already kind of tired and going to sleep. They may just get sleepy, fall asleep, and die. And this is particularly an issue with fires, but also if you have gas burning appliances in your house, like water heaters and furnaces. If they're not ventilated properly, or they're not burning efficiently, something's wrong with the way they're burning, they can create a lot of carbon monoxide, which is why it's important if you have gas burning appliances in your house that you have carbon monoxide detectors in there too, because you need something to wake you up and get you to realize, no, this isn't just you feeling tired. This is bad. Get out, because you can't smell it. You can't see it. So if you don't have a carbon monoxide detector, at least near your bedrooms, get one there, but then also put one near where you have gas burning appliances, so it'll go off before it gets up to the places where people are living. All right, so PSA aside, let's get into how we control our breathing rate. We all know that sometimes we breathe slower and sometimes we breathe faster. Why is that? Okay. Now, this is mainly controlled by the medulla and the pons, right down there in the brainstem. And it's a pretty basic control mechanism, because all living things have needed that since the beginning. So it's very deep in the brain there. We also have stretch receptors in the lungs to keep us from overinflating our lungs. It's not too much of a danger, but it is a bit of a one. So we do have those in there. And many factors can affect the respiratory rate, or how fast we breathe, and depth, how much air we move in and out every time we breathe. So volition, or voluntary. We can consciously control our breathing. Obviously, I can talk right now. I can hold my breath to go swimming. I can breathe faster if I want to. I can breathe slower if I want to. I can play my trombone, harmonica, or whatever. So we do have voluntary control over our breathing. However, we don't have enough control over it to get us to have harm. Okay, we can't hold our breath so long that we will kill ourselves. Okay, and this comes back to that equation you see here on the bottom that I showed you before with carbon dioxide and bicarbonate. Now, too much carbon dioxide in the blood will eventually convert into bicarbonate ions and release hydrogen ions. Those hydrogen ions make the blood acidic, right? So if we have too much carbon dioxide, our blood pH falls or becomes more acidic, and our oxygen levels will get too low at that point, and our brain will override any conscious signal to hold our breath. Okay, so there's two things we're looking at: the oxygen levels and the carbon dioxide levels, are specifically the blood acidity levels, and we won't be able to hold our breath until we, cause real harm. So the most important, the first thing that will trigger you taking a breath when you're trying to hold your breath for like a breath holding contest at the pool in the summer is high carbon dioxide levels in your blood, which technically you're measuring as low pH or acidic, okay, because you're increasing your carbonic acid and those hydrogen ions floating around. Your blood pH falls. Your brain says, oh, this isn't good. We're too acidic. Let's breathe, because we got to blow off that carbon dioxide to get our blood pH back to where it needs to be. Okay, and that will cause an increase in both rate and depth. You move more air and you'll breathe faster, because the faster you breathe, that keeps that carbon dioxide concentration in your lungs as low as possible. As you hold your breath, right, oxygen is still getting sucked out of the air and carbon dioxide is still getting put into the air in your lungs. So the longer the breath is in your lungs, the higher the concentration of carbon dioxide gets. And the higher the carbon dioxide concentration gets in your lungs, the slower that diffusion can happen. So if you want to maximize the rate of diffusion, we talked about this before, you want to maximize the difference in concentrations, which means you got to get that carbon dioxide out of your lungs as fast as you can and bring in fresh air that has a even lower carbon dioxide level. Okay, the secondary trigger is low oxygen. Believe it or not, it's the acidity of the blood, which is the first thing our body keys on. Now, if for some reason that doesn't trigger it, we do have a secondary set of receptors in our arteries that will trigger it if we have too low of oxygen. Okay. And so here's an example of that. So if our blood becomes alkaline, basic, okay, we don't have enough hydrogen in our blood. We're too basic, not enough acid. We will slow our breathing. And we slow that breathing, and what that does is it allows carbon dioxide to accumulate in our blood to bring our blood pH back down into the proper range, because we're making more carbonic acid. If you start to hyperventilate, if anybody's ever had that happen, what you're doing when you're hyperventilating is you're blowing off carbon dioxide. And if you blow off too much carbon dioxide, okay, remember, that's creating a big concentration difference in your lungs, and carbon dioxide leaves your blood faster. Okay, if you hyperventilate, you blow it off really fast, and if that carbon dioxide levels get too low, you can actually stop breathing. You'll get apnea. Okay, your body will say, stop breathing altogether, not just breathe slower, but stop breathing, and then you will stop breathing, and that'll try to raise the carbon dioxide levels, but then you tend to pass out too. So one way to get around that, they don't really do this too much anymore, is you can see people breathing in a bag if they're hyperventilating, because when you're breathing in a bag, what's happening is that carbon dioxide is not escaping, right? When you're hyperventilating, the problem is you're losing that carbon dioxide. Breathing in and out of the bag, you're rebreathing that higher carbon dioxide concentration, and that's going to help keep carbon dioxide in there and keep your blood moving towards the proper pH.
The stars around,
and that will do it for this section of the notes, guys. I imagine you might have a bunch of questions about the regulation stuff, so we'll tackle that live in class when this is done. See you next time.